Good afternoon and welcome to ShareSoc's webinar on the Woodford campaign and the Lee Day claim in relation to Woodford equity investment funds. We've scheduled this for an hour and a half. We've got some excellent presenters for you. I think it's going to be quite punchy, so you're going to hear as little as possible from me to leave time for Jeff Prestridge, Alan Miller, Boz Michalowska, and Cliff Waite to speak to you. If I can have the next slide, please. Usual disclaimer. No warranty given by ShareSoc as to reliability. These are people's opinions. This is for your information. If you're going to take any action across as a result of what you hear tonight, please ensure that you take appropriate professional advice or undertake your own further research as necessary. Next slide, please. Today, we've got the chat function disabled and the raise hand function disabled. So your communication with myself and with the panel is through the Q&A button. You can write questions. Some questions have been pre-submitted, but you're welcome to submit questions during the session. If you are looking to do that, please read the questions that are already up there. And if there is an existing question which addresses your issue, please put a thumbs up against it, and what that will do is it will raise it in the list, and so we will deal first with the ones that are of most interest to the audience. We have an audience of nigh on 1,000 people this evening, so that's a helpful means of doing things. Moving on, please. A very quick blah on ShareSoc. We're a not-for-profit member organisation run effectively by its board of directors. We have over 8,000 members. We have four real axes to what we do, which is information, education, networking, and campaigning stroke lobbying. And it's the campaigning stroke lobbying that you're listening to today. And then membership of ShareSoc will save you money on various services available to you. Next slide, please. So today, you heard from me. You're going to hear from Jeff Prestridge on the case for redress. Alan Miller is going to run us through an expose of the Woodford debacle. Cliff Waite is going to talk about the four legal claims that are effectively out there that are means for you to look for redress, as well as the financial ombudsman, which is an alternative approach. And Boz is going to run through the Lee Day process. Where are we? What's been done so far? What the response of Link Financial Services has been to the letter before action, and what happens next, which is, of course, key to most of you. Then we're going to end with a question and answer session, which will be around 6 o'clock, which will involve the whole panel. We may lose Jeff, I'm afraid, before that. So, but I'm hoping that he'll hang around for one or two questions before disappearing. He has deadlines. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm going to call Jeff, please, to open video and microphone and take the floor. Jeff, it's yours.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon. A big thank you to all of you who have joined us on this webinar today. It's a shame we're not meeting in person, but it's good to be part of this discussion. A big thank you also to ShareSoc for asking me to say a few words about the Woodford debacle, and for Lee Day in taking up the cudgels on behalf of Woodford investors. It is also wonderful that Alan Miller will be making a big contribution to this webinar on Woodford. On countless occasions, Alan has helped me get to grips with some of the key issues that brought about the downfall of Woodford equity income, the end of Woodford investment management, and the appointment of new managers at Woodford Patient Capital. There are few financial brains in the city bigger than Alan's. there are few braver commentators in the city than Mr. Miller. He's not frightened of anyone or any organisation, as evidenced by his constant criticism of the regulator's job to do its work effectively. Long live Alan, I say. Before I tell you why I feel passionately that justice must prevail over this investment travesty, I do first need to contextualise my role in uncovering some of the wrongdoing committed by those involved in the Woodford meltdown. Although I was looking into Woodford equity income long before it was suspended in June 2019, I have to admit that I was behind the curve compared to some commentators. The likes of Tom Winnerthrift at Share Profits were on to Neil Woodford long before I was. So to them, I say bloody well done. You were brave and you have been proved right. Yet it is a fact that over the past 27 months, I have probably written more column inches on Woodford than any other city or personal finance journalist. My view is a simple one. Justice must prevail. People and organisations need to be held to account for their role in allowing Woodford equity income to become anything but a UK equity income fund, resulting, of course, in huge investor losses. It's a stance that has not endeared me to many who work in the financial services industry, publicly that is, although privately their views have been more supportive. For example, they loved the fact that I drove up to Oxford at the crack of dawn to confront Woodford at his offices, only for him to refuse to see me and for security to warn me the police would be called if I continued to trespass on private property. What a fun morning that was, ladies and gentlemen. For the record, I've even lost long-standing friends as a result of my stance on Woodford. For example, Alan Steele, chair of Alan Steele Asset Management, until his sad death from COVID last month, ended our friendship in 2019 after I refused to give him a platform in the Mail on Sunday to defend Neil Woodford. He vowed never to speak to me again, and he was true to his word. It's also interesting that I have not won any awards for my work on Neil Woodford. Rocking, challenging the establishment, it seems, is not the done thing to do. So, where do we start with this sorry tale of greed, arrogance, self-interest, and neglect? With Neil Woodford, of course. He is the main culprit. He thought he could walk on water as a result of his prolonged investment success at investment house Invesco. Well, we all know only Jesus has ever managed that feat. Neil set up Woodford Investment Management thinking he was untouchable and that he didn't need anyone to hold him to investment account. Well, that is not the way good investment management works. There have to be checks and balances in place. Investment decisions need to be challenged. For some strange reason, maybe fueled by being honoured with a CBE, Neil also thought he was an investment pioneer who could help fund the creation of a number of dynamic and burgeoning healthcare companies. Yet Neil's forte was always investing in what I would call old world companies, tobacco giants, for example, that paid huge dividends. He should have stuck to his guns. It is also manifestly wrong that Neil Woodford labelled his main fund as equity income when it increasingly became anything but an equity income fund. Indeed, it was pushed out of the UK equity income fund sector because it didn't meet the criteria for inclusion. And to this day, I find it reprehensible that Woodford continued to take management fees of £65,000 per day from Woodford Equity Income once the fund had been suspended and investors were locked out. Talk about greed and feathering one's own nest. Deplorable. Maybe the Financial Conduct Authority will hold Neil Woodford to account for this debacle at some stage in the future, maybe even in my lifetime. But its lack of action since 2019 does not bode well. All I will say on this is that it will be a travesty if Woodford gets away with the widespread financial detriment he has caused. He should be fined and handed a city ban. As for the regulator's role in the Woodford meltdown, I am sure Alan Miller will have something to say on this, but it's obvious that it was lax on so many levels in the years and months leading up to the suspension of Woodford Equity Income. And as I said earlier, its subsequent investigation into the fund's suspension has crawled along at a snail's pace. Investors deserve better. As Alan Miller will confirm later, it is unlikely that the FCA's report into Woodford will be published until mid-2022 at the earliest. It's scandalous. I also find it alarming that the regulator has done nothing to address some of the underlying issues that did for Woodford Equity Income. Surely it is time for illiquid assets, including property, to be banned from funds such as Woodford Equity Income, which are open-ended in structure. They do not fit. Illiquid stocks cannot be offloaded if redemptions come flooding in. Their only home is in a closed-ended listed structure where assets do not have to be sold if investors want to sell their shares. The economics of supply and demand simply take over, resulting in a markdown in the trust's share price. Also, the regulator must have the power to force a fund to change its name if it is not doing what it says on the tin. It's misrepresentation, nothing else. Of course, Hargreaves Lansdown cannot escape criticism for its part in the tragic Woodford opera. It was recommending Woodford Equity Income right up until the day the fund was suspended. This is despite internal concerns about the fund's mounting exposure to illiquid assets. You'll probably know that legal action has been launched against Hargreaves Lansdown by litigation specialist RGL Management, a story, by the way, that I broke in March this year. This finally takes me on to Link, the authorised corporate director responsible for supervising Woodford Equity Income, for ensuring the fund was being run according to the rules. It is irrefutably the fact that Link failed in its regulatory duties. It allowed the fund to invest too heavily in illiquid shares. It failed to ensure that the fund's assets were sufficiently liquid in nature to allow investors to redeem their shares in an orderly fashion. In a nutshell, Link did not protect the best financial interests of every investor in the fund. So, in the absence of action from the regulator, it's absolutely right that Lee Day has started court proceedings against Link. It's a step I mightily applaud, and although no one should be under the illusion that justice will be swift, Link has to be held to account for its part in the destruction of Woodford Equity Income and the crystallisation of significant investor losses. Most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, investors must be compensated for the losses they have incurred as a result of Link's neglect. Justice must prevail. Without it, investor confidence in the integrity of this country's financial services industry will be irreparably damaged. We simply cannot allow that to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to me, and please keep reading the Mail on Sunday. Thank you.
Jeff, thank you very much indeed for that. And I omitted on your introduction to run through to run through your CV, but I mean, you are personal finance editor at the Daily Mail, and this is money, and you've taken a long-term interest in the Woodford story, and you've written literally dozens of articles calling for resolution of this case. I'm going to, because I know that you are time strapped at the end, just put one question to you at this point, if I may, which is, was, in your opinion, was the management of Woodford Equity Investment Fund's assets reckless, given the daily liquidity characteristics of the fund structure?
Yes, I do indeed, Mark. I think Woodford was running a fund that was open-ended in structure. You know, that structure is not suitable for the holding of illiquid assets that cannot be sold quickly if there is a run on the fund. You know, it exceeded its permitted limits on holdings in illiquid assets. So that was reckless by Woodford, and it was also pretty damning of Link's kind of oversight of a fund that it was being paid good money to ensure was being run in the best interests of investors. Just finally, Mark, I'm actually not personal finance editor of the Daily Mail or personal finance editor of This Is Money. I'm personal finance editor and wealth editor of the Mail on Sunday.
Fair enough. My misreading of your LinkedIn, I'm afraid. But Jeff, thank you very much indeed for that. I'm going to ask you, if I may, to mute and stop your video. I'm going to bring on Alan Miller, who is, and hopefully my LinkedIn reading is correct and my knowledge of Alan is correct, but he's founder and CIO of SCM Direct, which is an asset management firm. And along with his wife, Gina Miller, he founded the True and Fair campaign in 2012, which is focused on achieving better customer outcomes and on restoring trust in the financial sector. He has been very active in calling for an independent inquiry into the Woodford debacle. Alan, if that's correct, the floor is yours.
Okay. Evening, everybody. And I mean, I'm really sorry you've had to, in a way, have this evening, because it shouldn't be necessary. It shouldn't have happened, and you should have been properly compensated. And I'd just like to start off in a way, I think somebody should apologize to you properly, because I think you've been let down. When you invest with a fund manager, a fund managing group, you're trusting your savings with them. And of course, when fund managers buy stocks, they don't know what's going to happen with certainty, and no doubt, you know, nobody deliberately aims to lose money. But as Jeff said, and thank you, Jeff, for the unbelievable kind words. It is like yourself, we haven't won very many friends taking on the investment industry and trying to actually defend consumers who time and time again get taken advantage of. So I just like to apologize, if you like, on behalf of the whole industry that have let you all down. I think, you know, everybody's let you down. Link's let you down. Woodford's let you down. The regulators let you down. And maybe even the auditors to the fund accounts have let you down. Now, a lot of people in the media, and I wouldn't include Jeff in this, have thought that the problems happen, if you like, at the end. And what I'd like to show on these slides is it was going on from the very beginning, and that makes it 10 times worse. First slide, please. I mean, you'll know the history of Woodford. This just gives some of the key dates. 2014, he launches. So remember that year, 2014, April 2015, having got so much money, thanks to the Hargreaves marketing machine and other companies. He then launches Patient Capital Trust, raises another £800 million. In terms of performance, it seemed to cut off a lot of the disasters seemed to happen in 2017. There was an increasing flow of money out of the fund. It was highlighted in best invest dog funds. And eventually, I say eventually, the fund was suspended, basically because it had a very large redemption from one institutional client, which it simply couldn't finance. Next slide. Now, this is from the cover of a report and accounts. It's very small type, but these are all big companies that have been intrinsically involved within the fund. This comes from the first page of the report and accounts. So you'll see Capita, which, by the way, at the very beginning, Woodford wanted to have a different firm to Capita, and the FCA itself actually, I think, recommended Capita to be the ACD, or the authorized corporate director. You also have Northern Trust as a depository, and you have, of course, the people auditing the accounts, Grant Thornton. Now, like, I suppose, Jeff, you know, I'd like being, if you like, a forensic accountant. And I saw under one of the articles on Woodford a few years ago, a comment saying, how did the report and accounts be signed off, given it was in the back of the report and accounts, the issue with liquidity. And it said, as this commentator underneath an article said, as much as 40% was illiquid. So I got the report and accounts, and if we look on the next slide, you will see from the very beginning, and then you'll see this in every single fund accounts, there's a schedule which basically splits the most liquid, the next liquid, and they kind of completely illiquid securities. And they fall into kind of three categories, which is level 1, level 2, level 3. So level 1 securities is what you'd expect most of a typical equities fund, maybe not so much within a bond fund, because corporate bonds tend not to be actively priced. But a level 1 security is where the auditors who've signed off these accounts can find the unadjusted quoted price in an active market for identical assets or liabilities that can be found at the year-end date. So if you think about a company like BP or Shell, its equity is obviously traded every day. That goes into bucket 1. Now, it's corporate bonds. They may not, some of them may not be traded every day, but there's similar corporate bonds to gain a price for that. They might be in level 2. Level 3 is things like unquoted shares and quasi-unquoted shares, where it may have a price, but it rarely trades, it never changes, or is highly suspect, one might say. Now, if you actually look at the accounts, and this is the 2015 accounts, but you have the comparative, you can see there's two tables, and December 2014. So that's not many months after the fund started. I would expect, as a fund manager, that most of the fund would be, by definition, in highly liquid assets. And from the very beginning, you'll see that 2.9 billion out of 4.2 was in those assets, but actually about 1.2 billion, and we'll go on to percentages later, wasn't. And so this liquidity problem, which led, obviously, the performance problem was he bought arguably the wrong holdings at the wrong price, and it was exacerbated by the fund having to be suspended and the various sales, which was a function of the very low levels of liquidity. And if we go to next slide, it just gives the definition, as I said, of the liquid securities. So in 2014, these liquid securities, which I think I've gone through, these are readily liquid ones where you see a share price every day or a highly relevant price. So you can easily know what the value is. Next slide. Now, what I did was actually look at the report and accounts for Woodford. And these report and accounts were publicly available. They were publicly available to the various financial advisors. They were publicly available to Link. They were publicly available to the FCA. And they were publicly available to Hargreaves Lansdown. And the percentage which he had, not in the liquid, but in the less liquid, the level 2 and the level 3, as I said, started off at 30%. And even though you would expect normally as the fund grows in size, by definition, you tend to buy bigger companies and therefore more liquid than the smaller fund. But in his case, actually, the less liquid actually slightly increased in time. But it was 30%, 36%, 20%, 29%, 40%. So year after year, that was a high percentage. And I thought, well, what is a fair comparison to look at? So I actually looked at the fund he used to manage, both called income funds. Okay, one's called a high income fund and one's called an income fund. So that was the fund on the right on that table that he used to manage. And I took those from the same year set of accounts, and you can see what the percentage is. It's 5%. It's not 30%. It's not 20%. It was regularly, year after year, 5%. So the risk profile and the liquidity of this fund was completely different to actually the fund which he invested in. And he actually invested in unquoted when he was at Invesco Perpetual. Next slide, please. Again, I assume that the regulator has access to Bloomberg. Lots of financial advisors would have, or the larger ones, I would have thought would have access. And on Bloomberg, you can look at any fund. It will have the underlying holdings, and you can see, based on assumptions, okay, they might be better, might be worse, how long would it take and how much would it cost to liquidate a fund? And when I looked at this fund, I couldn't believe how illiquid it was. I thought the figures were wrong. I did it a number of times to check. And as you can see, based on normal assumptions, so participating basically in 10% of the volume of the holdings, how long would it take to sell the fund? Well, it would take 11,410 days. That's a lot of days. And the cost would be about 36% of the fund, which hasn't actually been probably an unfair comparison of what the cost has been overall on many of the holdings which have been subsequently liquidated. And then again, next slide, please. If we actually look, what I did was compare this with small company funds, some of the largest small company funds, to say, well, actually, you would think a small company fund investing in small companies, and I've personally managed in the past small company funds, amongst other funds, would have a high percentage. So we're dealing with funds which are naturally investing in less liquid securities. And let's compare the two. And again, there is literally there is no comparison. So even funds like Energy Recovery, Mitten, that was a multi-cap, so it had a lot of small cap. Marlborough micro cap, that's very small cap. Standard Life UK smaller. I tried to find, the less liquid funds because of whatever it is they invest in, and you don't get anywhere close to that illiquidity. So even the least liquid of those, when I looked at them at a comparable time period, so towards the end of 2018, you can see 11,400 compares with the next one down, which is 588 days. And the cost of, if you like, liquidating those funds, because of normally the high degree of small companies in it, nothing approached the 35.8%. So here we had what was a very substantial fund with a high degree of investment in a very high degree in less liquid companies. Next slide. And as Jeff said, I mean, one of the many scandals of this is the time of the FCA investigation. And we pressurized, we wrote to the various members of the Treasury Select Committee because there didn't seem to be much progress. And Jeff highlighted in one of his pieces the fact that a whistleblower had disclosed that many years after or several years after the investigation had started, that whistleblower wasn't aware of a single person who seemed to have had a call from the FCA. And one of the reasons the FCA gave for the slowness of the investigation was things like the COVID. But actually, almost at exactly the same time, within a month, Dame Gloucester started her investigation into LCNF. So her investigation took place throughout the COVID period. And again, you have to remember that most fund managers, I imagine all fund managers, all their records and everything are online, they're all in the cloud and they can be easily sent to somebody. And you can interview somebody remotely via Zoom. You don't have to travel to Oxford to interview somebody. Anyway, she started her investigation in May 2019. It took her 16 months. Now, she would have had to have gone through the legal process of making sure that it's called maximalization, that it was fit to be published and everything. And we've seen the various articles in the media about some ex-senior people from the FCA trying to get their names removed from that LCF report. Well, if you compare that with Woodford, it started at the same time. As Jeff said, it's likely to finish 3 years, so nearly double the amount of time that it started. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things we were surprised by is that if you actually, again, obviously, there's a number of parties which people will have different opinions on who was responsible, how much, but one of the parties is obviously the regulator. Now, that investigation, by all accounts of the various published statements from the FCA, does not appear to be looking at the FCA. So whatever role the FCA had in arguably not supervising Woodford or Link or other parties properly, or could have done it better, is not going to be investigated. So there's a high degree of probability this Woodford experience can happen again. And it can only stop being happened if there was a proper independent investigation. So we wrote to the FCA non-execs, the same non-execs who had allowed the LCF independent investigation, and we didn't get an answer. We're still waiting for their answer. And a non-exec is meant to basically challenge and oversee the regulator. Now, I find it very surprising, in my own personal view, to how they can perform that responsibility in a situation of a scandal where the public have lost more than £1 billion without a proper independent review of the FCA amongst other events that happened within Woodford. I find it very hard to understand, A, why they don't challenge the executives of the FCA to commission an independent investigation, and why, if you look at the next slide, it seems not to be even a subject of conversation in the FCA board meetings. Now, on the FCA site, there is somewhere you'll find board minutes. And a simple search of Woodford in every single month, and sometimes they meet more than 1 month's board minutes. It's interesting when I went through it, how often the subject of Woodford came up. Now, given the fact, partly thanks to us and partly thanks to others like Jeff and other experts kind of highlighting, the importance of having a proper inquiry, the Treasury wrote to the FCA about the progress. But even then, it hasn't even merited a mention in the board minutes. So one has to assume it was never discussed at an FCA board meeting, despite consumers losing more than £1 billion, despite the investigation likely to happen more than 3 years. There wasn't even a progress report to not just the executives, but the non-executives who fulfill that oversight function in the FCA. So the last time it was mentioned was between the 23rd and 24th October 2019, and they've had 38 meetings since. And that last point, which is how I started, which is what these various parties don't seem to realize, it is hugely damaging to the industry. It's hugely damaging to the reputation. We're meant to be professionals. We're meant to act like professionals. And when we make mistakes, we're meant to learn from it and not make the same mistakes over. If there isn't a proper investigation, if there isn't, when fault is found or likely to be found, people compensated, it brings the whole industry into disrepute. And I think that's completely wrong and it's shameful. And the regulators should, in my view, if you look at previous kind of large scandals, they've actually forced a compensation fund to investors. And it's wrong that, you know, all the people on this call are having to wait many years to receive back the compensation which they're rightly entitled to. And that's just completely wrong. And I think actually, you know, more pressure should be brought, whether it's to link Woodford, Hargreaves, FCA, whichever parties are responsible in their own various ways, should be held to account, and investors should be put right. And that concludes the sermon from Mr. Miller. Thank you.
Fantastic. Alan, thank you very much. That's fascinating, and it's a testament to the amount of work that you have been doing to put pressure on all the parties, I think, to come up with a degree of or at least to allow themselves to be properly investigated and reviewed. I'm going to put the same question to you as if I may, as I put to Jeff, which is, I think I know the answer, but was the management of WEIF's assets reckless given the daily liquidity characteristics of the fund?
In my view, yes. I mean, I can speak as a fund manager, and many years ago, I mean, I run portfolios of exchange traded funds, which are very, very liquid. But when I was running various funds, and I've run pension funds, I've run unit trusts, investment trusts, so I've run lots of different kind of mandates. The companies that I invested through, you know, the asset management company would normally have a rule that you couldn't own between the various different funds more than 10% of a company. So just by that, you know, there was quite a few companies where we'd be holding 20 or 30%. And of course, the problem is if you hold large percentages, it makes it even more liquid than otherwise. You can normally sell a few percent reasonably easily, but selling 20 or 30% is very difficult. And as I point out, the liquidity horizon of that fund was completely out of proportion to a fund offering daily liquidity, and even more out of proportion to a fund which says at the top income fund, which normally is a more conservative fund by its style. That's what people normally expect, in my view, when they invest in an income fund. It's not a kind of special sits fund or a small companies fund.
Yeah, I'm just going to underline your figures on that because I think using days, it doesn't really translate into people's minds as effectively. So if we look at it in terms of years, the next most illiquid fund, if you like, on your list was the Invesco High Income, and the time to liquidate there was 2.25 years. Everything else was less than that, apart from Woodford, where the time to liquidate is 44 years.
Yes,
I mean it's just unbelievable when you look at it in that perspective. I
mean, of course, these are based on you sharing a percentage of a volume of trades, and you could always, you know, create, if you like, a market by selling something at a big discount to its price. But in quite a lot of his holdings, literally kind of wasn't a price, or one or two. The only price was, you know, there was one of them now called Rutherford, a Proton Healthcare, and that kind of partially traded with kind of a few £100 on the Guernsey Stock Exchange. But the amount of money that went in, virtually all of it, simply came from him. So the price of that security was really one based on the price he was investing in and little else.
Fantastic. Alan, thank you very much. I'm going to ask you if you wouldn't mind to mute and stop your video for now, and I'm going to move on to Cliff Waite, who is Director of ShareSoc, who is the Director responsible for policy and campaigns, and specifically, he's responsible for our Woodford campaign. And Cliff, I'm just going to remind you that in practice, you did this in 6.5 minutes. I've seen the amount of slides that Boz has behind you, so I'm going to keep the pressure on. Cliff, over to you.
Good afternoon. I should be talking about the 4 different claims for compensation, but first of all, let me explain ShareSoc's involvement. We see ourselves as the Red Cross for individual investors, and we're on the side of the investor. We're independent, we don't have conflicts of interest, and we have a track record of success in campaigning. And we had 3 very clear objectives for our campaign. The first was to help investors claim compensation. The second, to hold to account those who've done wrong. And the third, there were problems in regulation, and we wanted to lobby to get things changed. New slide, please. The 4 claims themselves, they do not target Neil Woodford, nor do they Woodford Investment Management. And the reason for this is because you're not able to get litigation finance for such claims. Why is this? Well, it's expensive to sue, and it's only worth suing someone if they have deep pockets, and there's also a very clear case with a good, strong chance of success. Woodford Investment Management has no money, having paid it all out in dividends and remuneration to staff. Neil Woodford would be a very difficult case to prove in law that he's actually done anything wrong. And it's taken the FCA, as Alan said, an enormous amount of time for them to consider this point, and they have yet to opine on the issue. But I think this is because of the difficulty of proving anything against Neil Woodford. Link, in contrast, is a very much better case. It has the best probability of success, and it has deep profits, or at least we think they do. Many allege that Hargreaves did wrong. It has many investors want to be able to claim against Hargreaves, who they feel misled them. However, we must remember that Hargreaves only provide an execution-only service. Those are the terms and conditions that its clients signed up to. And they will argue they were not giving advice. In my opinion, it's arguable that they encouraged clients to buy the Woodford funds. Our data shows that Hargreaves clients are much more likely to hold Woodford funds compared to clients of other platforms like AJ Bell or Interactive Investor. Interactive and AJ Bell did not promote Woodford the same way that Hargreaves did. Hargreaves cut a cute marketing deal with Woodford, and they fed Woodford with seed capital of £1 billion. Their marketing materials stressed the lowest fee rates would be available via Hargreaves. However, counsel's opinion, and I've seen 3 of them, are clear that Hargreaves' case is not such a good one, and certainly nowhere near as good as the case against Link. So it will be difficult to get litigation finance for the claim against Hargreaves. I suspect that the case against Hargreaves is part of a land grab, trying to build a book of claimants, which is valuable in itself. Whenever there are multiple claims, there's a strong possibility of claims merging, and I think at that point, the claims against Hargreaves will get dropped. That's my view. New slide, please. The no-win, no-fee promise actually requires both litigation finance and insurance. Litigation finance to pay the cost as you proceed, and the insurance in case you lose, get counter-sues and cost awards awarded against you. So the insurance gives comfort to claimants. Lead A have both, so do Harkers Parker. RGL have finance for their initial phase. but not for the whole amount. They got an offer, I'm told, but I don't know. I haven't seen it. I don't know how detailed the terms or how expensive they are, and I'm not sure what the position is with Slater and Gordon. In terms of claimant numbers, that it's pretty clear that Lead-A are well in the lead in this race. And in terms of fees, well, Lead-A is 30% compared to Harkus Parker 42%. And RGL is looking very good at 25%. And it's also attractive that their claim is against Hargreaves. But we must remember that they actually haven't signed up insurance or finance yet. And it's very important to remember that Link has made it clear, very clear, its intent to defend the claims vigorously. New slide, please. So if we were climbing Mount Kilimanjaro, we would have to do a lot of planning just before we got started, and we'd have base camps in the foothills. And I'm afraid this is where most of these claims are. They've done a letter before action, but there's years to go yet. Lead-A, I would say, is much further ahead, having issued proceedings this week. New slide, please. And in November 2021, ShareSoc decided to endorse Lead-A's claim, and we used 5 criteria to evaluate these. I've mentioned the first 4. The 5th one's very important. It's the waterfall issue, as where the money goes. And we looked at the small print very carefully to make sure there was no repeat of what happened with the RBS settlement, which still hasn't reached the claimants. So we're pretty pleased with the benefit of hindsight that we appear to have made the right call. And it's now my great pleasure to hand over to Boz, who's the lead lawyer for Lead-A on this case. And she's has been struggling with a cold, so she's very bravely got in to do this. So
I think you're handing back. I think you're handing back to me, actually.
Oh, right. Okay.
So, and I shall have the great pleasure of. Now, before doing that, I just wanted to underline something that I mentioned at the last webinar that we held. There is a question that arises: does ShareSoc have a stake in the claim? And the answer is no. However, ShareSoc does receive an amount of money on a monthly basis from Lead-A for its assistance in running this running the campaign. So for clarity and transparency, everyone should be aware of that. Thank you very much, Cliff. And yes, Boz is partner at Lead-A, and she's responsible for the Woodford process, and she is going to give you a whistle-stop tour through an alarmingly large number of slides. Boz, over to you. And Boz is feeling, well, she's been losing her voice to a degree, so there is a possibility that we will switch horses to Muriel Hodgson-Teal at some point during the presentation if she runs out of voice. Thanks, Boz.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I do apologise if I'm coughing away at you. I'll do my best. Thank you. If we go on to the next slide, please. I'm just going to give you a quick introduction by way of brief reminder, particularly for those people who've not been there at the previous ShareSoc seminar, which I presented. So I'm going to explain who we are, what our funding arrangements are. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the case that we're putting forward and the correspondence that we've had to and fro with the defendants. I'm going to explain to you about limitation of the dates by which people should be issuing proceedings and what happens next. Next slide, please. So Lead-A, we are, as I said, as you know, I'm a partner at Lead-A and with the solicitors on this case, and we specialise in kind of large-scale, complex litigation, group claims, and always on behalf of claimants. I guess we're best known for commitment to acting on behalf of David and Goliath type litigation. We're working with senior counsel from Fountain Court Chambers, Derek Dale QC, and both Derek and Fountain Court have a fantastic reputation in complex financial services and commercial litigation. Tenny on a banjo of 3 Verulam buildings is our lead junior, and she specialises also in financial services. She's completed a secondment with the FCA, and so she really is steeped in the regulations. We're also working with Fideris, who are an international economic consulting firm specializing in economic analysis of financial and competition litigation matters. So they're very well suited to help us. Next slide, please. I apologize. So our funding arrangements are that we are acting on a conditional fee agreement. We've got the benefit of third-party funding from an external provider. That ensures that we can bring this, we've got the resources to take this matter all the way through to trial, and that we can also do it on a no-win, no-fee agreement or conditional fee agreement, whereby the success fee that we charge is going to be limited to a maximum of 30% of damages recovered. So if we're successful, then the cost of the funding and insurance and the success fee is paid out of claimant's damages, out of that 30%. And so it's capped at 30%, and that's including VAT. So claimants under the funding agreement that we've got in place can be sure that they will retain 70% of their damages, of those damages that we recover from the defendant. Now, if we're unsuccessful and the claimants lose, so under a CFA, you don't have to pay your lawyers and you don't have to pay the funder, but the loser pays the winner's costs. So losing claimants don't have to pay, they don't have to pay us, they don't have to pay their lawyers, but they do have to pay the defendants. And assuming if the defendants are successful. However, we've got after the event insurance provided by A-rated insurers in place, and they will indemnify our clients in respect of that risk. And so our clients are protected. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what is the claim? The claim is on behalf of direct investors in Woodford Equity Income Fund against Link, the breach of statutory duty. So Link delegated its investment management functions to Woodford. However, Link cannot delegate its responsibility to the FCA and investors. So as the authorized corporate director, Link is the entity responsible for the management of the fund and is legally responsible and accountable to the FCA and the investors of the fund. So whereas Neil Woodford are responsible for strategic investment management decisions, it's the role of Link as the ACD to make sure that the decisions made were in the best interest of every investor in the fund, which you've heard before. Now, it's the authorized corporate director's role, Link's role, to ensure that the fund follows the FCA rules designed to protect investors. So we say it's their failure to do so that led to the suspension of the fund and loss to investors. So the claim is one, therefore, of breach of statutory duty under Section 138 of the Financial Services and Markets Act, FSMA, for breaches of FCA core rules. Next slide, please. So what are those rules? So Section 138 of the Financial Services and Marketing Act, FSMA, that provides that an authorized person, such as the ACD, if they breach FCA rules, a private person is entitled to seek damages for losses resulting from those breaches. So Section 138 is there designed to protect retail investors, and it gives retail investors a right of action. It doesn't apply to institutional investors. Next slide, please. So what are the key rules? What are the key rules? We say it's the key collective investment rules, COL rules, FCA handbook. COL rule 5, I'm not going to go through the details of it. I've set them out on the slide here. But basically, in summary, Call 5 says that the ACD was to ensure that there was a prudent spread of risk, that transferable securities did not compromise the ability to meet redemption requests, and it had to ensure that no more than 10% of its portfolio was held in unlisted companies. So Link is effectively obliged under the FCA rules to ensure that the fund has sufficient liquidity to meet redemption requests. So next slide, please. Call 6. So in addition to responsibilities regarding appropriate liquidity of the fund, so that it meets those requests, redemption requests, particularly bearing in mind it's an open-ended investment trust where shares can be redeemed on any dealing day. It also has an obligation to comply with rules relating to the fair and accurate valuation of the investments and units held in the fund, both pre and post suspension. Next slide, please. So what did Link do wrong? We, in summary, it breached the FCA rules in that it failed to ensure prudent spread of risk. It failed to appropriately manage liquidity. It failed to comply with the 10% limit at all times. It failed to ensure that the liquidity profile of the investment was appropriate in light of it being an open-ended investment trust. It failed to keep an eye on Woodford's performance and to properly manage it and monitor it. And it failed to carry out a fair and accurate valuation of the fund. And it's again, as we say, Link's breaches during the life of the fund that led to the loss and subsequent suspension, and its breaches during the winding up of the fund that further aggravated the losses suffered by investors. So next slide, please. So where are we now? We sent out our letter before action to the defendants on the 5th of March. That letter set out our case. That letter was a 53-page letter, and it was supported. We appended to that 3,000 pages of annexed supporting documents evidencing our case. We also requested that it provided us with key disclosure of documents that were not publicly available. So, a lot is out there in the public domain, but the nitty-gritty is not. FCA has that available, we presume, and certainly, but it's within Link's remit to provide that information now. But we also reminded it and requested it now to accept its liability towards investors. We asked them to enter into discussions regarding how investors would be compensated so that we can avoid having to take that next step of going all the way, issuing proceedings and having to take the matter through to trial. We're trying to, the role of this pre-action correspondence phase is to try and narrow those issues and try to see if there's a way of resolving the case and reaching resolution without having to take recourse to the actual proceedings themselves. So what we set out, what compensation are we actually seeking on behalf of our clients? Now, we believe our clients are entitled to receive a return of the money that they invested, less how much investors received back through capital distributions during the fund's winding up, plus a return on the investment that they are entitled to expect. So the big question mark here is, what is that return? And that return, we say, is assessed by reference to the performance of a fund that would have been compliant with FCA rules. So we've been working with experts and doing significant research to determine what that appropriate comparator benchmark is so that we can properly assess what that expected return is. But if you go to Woodford's annual reports, they typically compared the fund's performance to the FTSE All-Share Index. Now, between launch in June 2014 and suspension in June 2019, the FTSE All-Share Index had a total return of index of 29%. So we should hold them to that. Next slide, please. So we had the defendant's response on the 4th of June. So they criticised the length of our letter, but they responded with a 40-page response via Clifford Chance. Now, that response is marked confidential, so I can't go into the detail of it. But in summary, they did not dispute Link's responsibilities under FCA. However, they denied they breached any of the coal rules. So as an overview, effectively, they say that the investment strategy was always as set out in the prospectus, which they say always stated that the fund would invest in unlisted companies and overseas entities. And they maintained that the fund always had a prudent spread of risk. It always had sufficient liquidity to cover normal redemptions, and that the only reason why the fund had to be suspended was because of the very unexpected and unprecedented requests for redemptions in May and June 2019. That's a very, very broad summary of what they've said. Next slide, please. They also said that any losses suffered by our clients are merely attributable to their decision to invest in Neil Woodford himself, or in the fund. And clients should have been aware that he had a well-established contrarian investment approach, and they should have been aware of his underperformance. Again, they attribute also the loss to Kent County Council's redemption request, which they allege could not have been foreseen. Next slide, please. So what happens next? So there's been a much exchange of correspondence. We've requested evidence supporting the defendant's position. To assist, we need that in order to properly evaluate the case and give the defendants the chance to properly put their case forward. We've requested disclosure. We specifically requested that disclosure, as I said previously, that's not publicly available, but which would be readily available to them, considering that they presumably had to prepare all of that documentation to give it to the FCA as part of their investigation. And the FCA said that they'd gathered over 20,000 items of relevant material. However, the defendants have not been willing to provide us with the majority of the key disclosure that we've requested. And they're of the view that our detailed their detailed response and our research thus far is sufficient for us to particularize our claim. So it's clear we've reached an impasse. The pre-action phase has come to an end, and there's no indication that defendants are willing or to consider settlement. So there's no point letting dust gather on this any further. The sooner we issue, the sooner we get to trial, the sooner we reach resolution. Accordingly, we issued proceedings at the High Court in the Chancery Division on behalf of 100 of our clients on Monday. Now, you might have seen some media coverage in that, and the media approached Link, and their response to that, if I may read it out, is Link Fund Solutions has become aware that Lead A has filed a claim in relation to the Equity Income Fund. Link Fund Solutions has not yet been served and vigorously defend itself against any proceedings. A key responsibility of Link Fund Solutions in its role as corporate director of the WEIF, now LF Equity Income Fund, was and it is to act in the best interest of all investors in WEIF. Linked Fund Solutions takes this and its other responsibilities very seriously and considers that it has acted at all times in accordance with applicable rules, as well as in the best interest of all investors, and it will continue to do so. So, as I said, the purpose of issuing for only a small group of our clients is effectively to get that court timetable ticking. It's clear, both from the letter, through our response to letter before action and the subsequent correspondence, and Link's own public statement, there's no point wasting time in further discussions. We've got to get the clock ticking. We've got to move as quickly as possible. And that's the purpose of issuing proceedings now. Next slide, please. Now, we're going to be issuing further claim forms for our clients on a rolling basis. So we're going to have that we will be issuing for all of our clients that have provided us with supporting documentations, and those will be kind of contract notes from their platforms or from their IFAs, and from those they've got to also pass all ID checks. And so claimants have statutory limitation periods, and claimant must issue their proceedings before that limitation period expires. And so we are going to be prioritizing clients, the issuing of claimants on the basis of when they started to invest in the fund. So how do you calculate that limitation period? The limitation, our statutory limitation, runs 6 years from the date that a cause of action accrues. Excuse me. In a claim for a breach of statutory duty, a cause of action accrues when damage is suffered. Now, there's a good argument that the damage was only suffered when the fund was actually suspended. So it could arguably run from June 2019. But the claim we're taking forward against the Link is a breach of FCA rules, and therefore a 6-year time limit for issuing starts from when the rules were breached. So bear in mind, it's not from the date of investment. So our research indicates that breaches are likely to have occurred from 2016 to 2017, and I think that's obviously supported by Jeff and Alan, if not even sooner. But I think we can with some clarity have a 2016 date, late 2016. Damage could therefore arguably be said to have occurred from that date. So we're recommending clients to start to issue proceedings next year. We're taking you always have to have an abundance of caution when assessing limitation. Next slide, please. So what's the timetable ahead? Now a claim has been issued. The claim form and the particulars of claim, which formally allow the particulars of claim a document, separate document from the claim form, and that sets out the case in detail and specifies the facts we rely on. And that has to be served within 4 months, so no later than the 26th of January next year. The general rule is that the defendants will then have 28 days in which to serve their defence. However, considering the complexity of the case, and no doubt the length of our particulars of claim, they may require longer. So there may be an agreement in relation to extensions of time for them to respond. Claimants will then be able to serve a reply to a defence. The parties then may request further and better particulars of their statements of case. So we need to try and narrow the issues down as far as possible in preparation for trial. So it's not really possible for me to give you a clear timetable ahead going forward, because it is very much dependent on the time that the defendant needs to respond to us, the detail in their defence, whether they want further information from us. So, but ultimately the clock is now ticking. We've got a date by which we're going to serve by, and everything therefore flows from there on. Next slide, please. Now we are going to be asking for and applying for a group litigation order as soon as possible. Now, a group litigation order, or a GLO, that's a mechanism which permits large numbers of claims which give rise to common or related issues of fact or law to be managed collectively. The GLO, or GLO, that's going to provide an automatic structure and timetable to the litigation. So there's likely to be multiple claim forms issued from thousands of clients, not just by Lead Day, but the other firms that have been mentioned. And under a GLO, all of those claim forms are going to be, and all of those cases and claimants are going to be consolidated and managed together. Now, a GLO will also provide formal cost sharing provisions so that all claimants that are bringing a claim against Link that fit the GLO criteria, they are going to they will share the risks and the benefits of progressing the case as one. It's also going to, as part of the GLO, you're going to have a group register, and that group register will include details of all the claimants participating in the group, and all the claimants sharing in the costs, sharing in the case management. And it also will establish that date, that the GLO will give a date for the group register to open, and it will give a date for that group register to close. That cutoff date is going to give the defendants some clarity as to what their degree of exposure is going to be. And once they've got that, they may be more encouraged to settle the group. Now, next slide, please. As part of the GLO, there's going to be directions given as to service of, or there may be, but there's one of the potential directions that is given, is an order for service of generic particulars of claim. So rather than each individual having to serve a very detailed document setting out all of the facts that we rely on, all the law, etc., you can serve one generic particulars of claim that covers all issues, all common issues.
Boz,
yes,
can I suggest we're getting slightly into the long grass here, and we want to get some questions in front of people.
Yes, well, we are, as I said, there will be directions given going forward. Trial is likely to, it's going to be a long, hard-fought trial. We don't, I anticipate it's likely to be in around the end of 2024. It could last up to 3 to 6 months. It all very much depends on the defendant's approach to this. But if we have the next slide, please. I always have to say, and as ever, investors should be aware that there are other routes to redress, and they're not obliged to join group action proceedings. It was always available to them, the Financial Ombudsman Scheme, and the details of that are on the website, and claimants should always check the time limits that apply to any applications to the FOS. Thank you very much. So if you've got any questions and we don't have time to address them today, you can please contact us on the details that are on the slide there now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Boz. I'm going to ask all the panelists to open their videos and microphones now, if I may, but there's a couple of questions that have been arising that are specifically to Boz's last presentation. And particularly, there seem to be quite a few people who have tried to register with Link and are either waiting for login details or are waiting for documents that follow on from that. And there is a related question, which is whether or not the 100 claimants in the claim that has been issued so far know that they are, whether they've been notified that their name has been used as part of that claim?
Yes, they have been notified. In relation to people that have tried to register with us, and they haven't received their link so that they can provide their documents, please check your spam. If you are a representative claimant, that's kind of unfortunate. You should be receiving those emails this week. So, but if you're not a representative claimant, or you don't have a shared email, you don't share an email with someone, which is creating some difficulties, I think, with getting documents out. If people share an email address, two people use the same address, that does create some problems. But we've resolved that now, and you should now all have received your link in which to formally upload your documentation. If you haven't received that, please check your spam box. If not, please get in touch with us again.
Thank you very much. And another frequent question is whether or not there is any prospect of a claim in relation to either Woodford Income Focus Fund or the Woodford Patient Capital Trust.
So the claim at the moment that we're bringing is, as we said, a breach of FCA rules that led to, as a result of which the fund was suspended and wound up. We've got to have a very laser focused strategy, because the aim is here to get compensation for people as swiftly as possible. Patient capital and income focus were not wound up. So they are not currently being considered as part of this litigation. It would have to be a separate claim.
Thank you. I'm going to turn, if I may, to Alan, and just looking at the responses that were received there, or the sort of broad explanation of the responses that were received there. In your view, did the fund have a prudent spread of risk?
Well, I suppose not. I mean, the reason I'm hesitating is the liquidity. The liquidity management, in my view, was in a sense dire. Now, whether the fact they had lots of different holdings, so they spread the risk in different companies, but the degree they invested in various securities wasn't appropriate to an income fund.
Thank you. And Jeff, do you have a view on this, on that same point?
No, I'm with Alan. I do have one question, Mark. Actually, of Boz, if I don't mind. If the we go through with the group litigation, how does that impact on the fees that the various litigation specialists are currently charging? Do they still apply?
The fees that the various,
I think the waterfall. So you've got different waterfalls with different different legal claims, and I think the question is, if you sign up to one at 30% and sign up to, and somebody else signs up to one at 42%, when those are brought together, is there some kind of homogenization, or do you get the deal that you originally signed up to? Is that the question?
Absolutely.
No, the contract, the agreements that people have are with the individual law firm, and the success fees that apply, they do not change. Right. So what you share, because those are success fees that are charged. The actual costs are the kind of the base costs of what's shared going forward as part of the group litigation is the base costs of actually doing the work, not the success fee on it.
All right.
And there's different arrangements in place. There are CFAs, there are DBAs, and they are differently structured.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to Alan again on the responses from Link. Did in your view the fund have sufficient liquidity at the time of suspension to cover normal weekly levels of redemption, or was the damage already done?
I think the damage was done. And in terms of normal, I think that's a pretty unfair excuse by Link, because you'd expect a fund underperforming to the degree that fund was to have escalating levels of redemptions. So to compare with a normal from when it was kind of 2 or 3 years prior to what was pretty consistent underperformance for, you know, since Brexit or whatever the period of time was, I can't remember exactly when it massively diverged, but it wasn't 1 or 2 months. And what happens with fund flows is after a period of underperformance, they accelerate.
Okay.
And they should have managed for that. Sorry, they should have managed the fund properly, because it wasn't exactly, it shouldn't have been a surprise.
Okay, and slightly different tack. What the winding up? It's clear that for a significant proportion of Wave's assets, forced liquidation was never going to achieve the best outcome. Why, in your view, did Link not present alternative solutions to fund holders, whether that's a permanent capital vehicle, whether that's in specie transfer, or whether that's the option to go for liquidation, but option rather than obligation?
Well, I can't answer for why they decided that, but in my view, unit holders would have been much better served if they simply, the assets that could have been sold at the market price easily, which was a reasonable percentage, whether that's say 60% of the fund, were sold, and the other 40% or 30%, whatever that percentage was, would have been put into an investment trust with a gradual winding down, because that way, whatever the value of those assets, they would have probably been priced in the market at 20%. People could have actually got access to the money much earlier, and the managers of that winding down vehicle could have selected, you know, depending on the best offers, which ones to do first and which ones to do later. So it was a complete and utter mismanagement in my view.
Thank you. And Jeff, your view on that same question?
I don't really want to kind of be seen to be a puppet of Alan, but I do agree. I do agree with him. I mean, it did seem quite a stark decision by Link, you know, to decide to wind up the fund, you know, without it kind of revealing or exploring other routes. It was, you know, it's a very dramatic decision, and I'm, you know, I imagine it must have bounced that off the regulator. It must have got approval from the regulator. But to me, I mean, it probably wasn't the best route forward, and one where, you know, the liquid assets, as Alan has said, you know, were sold off, you know, straight away. That would have made good sense, and then careful management of the more illiquid assets, and as Alan says, may be held in the structure of an investment trust where, you know, investors can trade their shares, albeit maybe at a discount to asset value.
Yep, thank you. I'm going to move to more generic questions now. And Cliff, could you explain why only 5 to 10% of potential claimants have registered so far across the various routes?
Very disappointing why so few have registered. There's 270,000, we think, out there. So they should be thinking how to get some money back. And it's thousands of pounds that people are talking about. So, I mean, Jeff is doing a great job in the Mail on Sunday in publicising this. We need more of the press and media to publicise that this is available. I'm not sure whether some people are a bit reticent to actually make a choice now, but we've tried now this evening to lay out the 4 different claims which are available and give them pros and cons of them. And the more we can do that, hopefully the more people will make their decision to join one of these claims. And there is a time limit to this, as Boz has pointed out.
Yeah, and a lot of questions we've been having have been about window, and I hope we've answered those window questions on the way through.
Mark,
yes,
just point on what has just been said, because I think it is very relevant here. I mean, the sad fact of life is that I think the media have got a little bit bored about the Woodford story, and you can see that to an extent this week by the, I thought, very subdued coverage, you know, in response to Lead A's announcement. So the media's lost interest, and that, I think, makes it far more difficult for ShareSoc and Lead A to kind of widen the, you know, the net of claimants. So, you know, it's a real shame. I mean, I get very, very upset that some of my colleagues in the media have, you know, have almost kind of shunted the Woodford debacle to one side. And I don't think that's right. I think we need to keep, you know, the attention on this situation to bring to the justice that investors, the 270,000 investors, deserve. So I'll be doing my bit on Sunday, that's for sure.
Thank you, Jeff.
I'm going to also add that if this were a listed company, we would have the ability to communicate with all of the shareholders on the register. And we have attempted to do that in this case because there is a register of fund holders, and we have been rebuffed, perhaps unsurprisingly, by Link in that process. But I think there is an obligation and there's a responsibility to make on Link's part to ensure that that fund holders are made aware of the possibility of legal redress, and I'm rather disappointed that they've not facilitated that. Cliff,
I echo that, Mark. And with a company, you've got there's a facility to get hold of the shareholder register, and the law needs to be changed, and we'll definitely be lobbying government to change the law that it should not be able to hide.
Thanks, Alan.
Just one thought on that. I mean, could anybody like yourselves try and encourage the FCA, since they're not actually having a compensation fund, to at least force Link to send to each unit holder a list of the various kind of parties of claim, to force them to kind of to say, you may be aware of the various parties with claims on behalf of Woodford investors, and it's your prerogative to either do that or use the financial services compensation scheme. At least then every single investor would receive a letter reminding them that what their options are.
It's a good question, Cliff.
Yeah, and also I've written to Hargreaves Lansdown and invited them to send such communication to their clients, so that they could be fully aware of this, and they have not to date agreed to do that. So I think that's a black mark for Hargreaves Lansdown, and I'll write again. It's a good point, Alan.
Agreed.
Shouldn't the FCA do that as part of its core responsibility in terms of protecting consumers and telling consumers, if it's not going to do what I think it should do, which is force compensation, a compensation fund to be set up and paid out, to at least inform shareholders of their various rights and the various actions taking place which they may or may not want to join. The very least you could do by actually instructing Link and instructing Hargreaves to write to all people affected, saying, with a pre-agreed letter listing the various options they have.
The other day, Charles Randall, the chair of the FCA, agreed to meet me, and I'll raise that point with him. Hopefully we got a bit of a momentum behind it now.
Agreed to meet us again. He has been quite available to us, which is positive. Excellent. Cliff, in terms of the legal redress versus financial ombudsman, have you got a view? And I know this is dangerous turf, or it's sensitive turf, but what's the best way of making a claim for fund holders?
Well, it's free to do it by the financial ombudsman, but you don't know how long it's going to take. And they haven't settled any claims against Link so far. They've settled 3 claims against IFAs. So if you've got a claim against an IFA, you think the ombudsman might work. And we've got a meeting coming up actually at the end of October with the chairman and the chief executive of the financial ombudsman to discuss how slow they've been and what they think they should be doing on this, and try to get a better understanding of the issues.
Okay, we are at 6:30. I'm going to continue. I fully appreciate if people need to drop off, whether those people are panelists or.
You've still got 547 people
absolutely
listening in. So
and I've got 75 open questions. So I'm gonna bat on for a little while if that's okay.
Mark, I've got to go. Sadly.
I know, Jeff, and it was you that was primarily aimed at. Thank you very much for attending. It was fascinating. And much appreciated.
Thank you. And if any of the 547 people who are still listening to this wonderful debate want to contact me at the Mail on Sunday, please urge them to email me. I'd love to hear their views on how they feel about Woodford.
We'll do that.
Okay.
Jeff, thank you very much indeed. Much appreciated.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you, Jeff.
Bye.
Okay, I'm going to try and do some justice to the principal questions that are on the screen at the moment. The one with the highest number of thumbs up is: if the action is successful, do Link have deep enough pockets to pay the compensation due to investors? And I think, Boz, that's a sort of where do we go if they fail the question as well. So if you wouldn't mind taking that in the first instance.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Link should have indemnity and insurance in place. There's no reason to believe that that's not going to be sufficient to meet this. They certainly should have, bearing in mind the size of the assets that they have under management. Bearing in mind that the assets that they have under management as at June 2020, so they operated 107 UCITS and 93 AIFs, and they had respective assets under management of 41 billion and 7 billion. They are a subsidiary of Link Administration Holdings. In November, Link was purchased, that group purchased Capita Assets for which was 909 million, and Capita Asset Services operated 4 major business segments, and the Link Fund Solutions was the major part of that. So, question mark, is there such an important part of the parent company's business that we'd be surprised if the parent would allow and let Link hang out to dry. But in the event that their insurance is insufficient, that the parent company will allow it to fail, clients, once you have judgment and once they are in default of that judgment, and there's an award of damages made against them and they are in default of that award of damages, clients are entitled to claim again via the FSCS.
Thank you very much. We have some polls, and I'm going to ask Amanda to bring up the first poll, if I may. So the question is, did you own the following? Did you own the Woodford Equity and Income Fund, the Income Focus Fund, Patient Capital, Hargreaves Lansdown's multi-manager funds? There are 6 of them, I think, that had Woodford exposure, or none of the above. And I'm going to let that run for a few seconds whilst we move on to the next question. I have a question that came in pre-registered, which is: the lead A claim doesn't make any claim based on Hargreaves Lansdown. If the lead A class members don't obtain satisfactory redress from Link, will lead A class members be precluded from pursuing HL for their uncompensated losses? Boz.
If you want to bring a claim against Hargreaves Lansdown, you first of all have to establish that there was a problem with the fund. That it wasn't managed properly. Once you've established that it wasn't managed properly, as you would do in the case against Link, you then have to have a further hurdle to overcome, which is that Hargreaves failed in its obligations. So I would have thought if you don't achieve a claim, if you're not successful in a claim against Link, you're not going to be successful in a claim against Hargreaves Lansdown. But if we are unsuccessful in the claim against Link and the client is still within time and it's a different cause of action and the claimant is still within their limitation period, they could arguably do so.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to end this poll now, and 96% of attendees are in the Woodford Equity Investment Fund. 24%, so we have some overlap, are in Woodford Income Focus Fund. 24% are in Woodford Patient Capital, and 29% is in the Woodford Multi-Manager Funds, and 2% none of the above, which I hope our press raring to report the meetings. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Amanda. And if you want to put the next one up, we'll run that again whilst we're taking.
The point that Boz is making is that the claim will be paid out in full. All your losses will be recompensed. It's not a case of that a Link claim would only get 75% of your claim, and then you want to try and have a go at Hargreaves Lansdowne for the other 25%.
Yes, that assumes no settlement, no agreement, no compromise.
Yeah, if we go all the way to trial, then you would be able to recover 100% of your damages from the defendants. Of course, there is potential of settlement, and in those circumstances, there's a negotiation to be had.
Okay, there's a question as to whether or not the FCA could or should be included in any litigation, given their role.
Sure they should, but I don't think you're going to get any financial litigation finances for such a claim, because they're going to hide behind the laws. And there was a marvellous performance by the chief executive of the FCA in front of the Treasury Select Committee, and he explained what the laws were, and then he was subsequently appointed to be and promoted to be governor of the Bank of England. So I don't think the politics are looking good for a claim against the FCA.
Okay, and I have a few questions that are asking about consequential loss. So an example is somebody who held their Woodford equity income inside an ISA wrapper, and therefore is doubly hurt by the loss of tax of tax benefits, and another holder who is looking to transfer from one platform to another, but unable to transfer their holdings because the Woodford is included in there, and feel that they are therefore suffering incremental loss. Is there any route to reclaim consequential loss here?
Well, we would be claiming ultimately in relation to the tax aspect of it. We can't advise on the application of the tax to any proceeds that you've received from the claim itself. We will be claiming for, as I said previously, the return of the balance, plus the key thing is what you were entitled to expect as a return on your investment. Those are the two aspects. In relation to other individual matters and individual claims, then I would suggest that the person making that inquiry gives us a call or contacts us, and we'll liaise with that on an individual basis.
I think the point they're raising is that would their funds grow in gross terms or net of any tax? And they say they were in ISA, so they want a gross return. So when you're comparing the performance since 2000, you said the 29% increase with the FTSE, that's a gross figure rather than net of tax.
Yep. Okay, so registering a claim, have you registered a claim with any of the following? And 93% is with Lee Day, 1% of the audience is with Harkus Barker, 2% with RGL, which I think shows the attraction of the 25% waterfall there. Slater and Gordon, 1%, which is interesting because I wasn't aware that they were actually formally proceeding. And 4% with Financial Ombudsman, 3% with Other, which again is an interesting response. Thank you very much for that. Group litigation order. Boz, I'm going to press you a little bit on that. Is there anything? Is there any progress around discussions around a group litigation order? Is there? You gave us a sort of explanation of what it is. Is there any movement in that direction?
Now I have to be very careful as to what I say.
It's a trick question.
It's an open forum, and we don't know who is actually listening. So I can't really give away the real details of the any discussions that we've had in place. But the point of a GLO is that it's as coordinated and a cost-efficient way of progressing litigation. The point that there will be a steering committee will be appointed that will run that litigation. So it's important that that steering committee will be made up of all of different claimant firms that have got the wherewithal and the resources to be able to run the litigation through to trial. Not every firm will be on the steering committee or would want to be on the steering committee, but we have reached out to firms to start the discussions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. It was a bit of a sly one, but the next one on the online questions is, so that we're clear, is there any circumstance where a claimant would be expected to pay any monies to lead A if the action was not successful?
So we have, if the action's not successful, then we've got after the event insurance in place. So any circumstances where an individual may have some exposure, that will be if, excuse me, if a claimant has not been truthful with us, if the client, once you sign up to a claim, you've got to be committed to it. You can't just change your mind halfway through. So particularly if somebody has decided to progress and issue proceedings, and then having issued proceedings decides to withdraw from the claim because they've changed their mind, that will incur an adverse cost. That will have been considered a loss for that individual client. And that may not be covered by the insurance policy, because the insurance policy expects you to, once you've decided that you're committed to that litigation, to see it through to the end.
Thank you for that. And so I think the just in terms of credit risk, there is a sort of infinitesimal chance that everything falls over and the insurers fail. But you're in the normal process of things, provided that a claimant doesn't withdraw, there is no chance of any further money going down this particular route.
There's always, I encourage everybody to look at our FAQs on our website, because that gives detailed explanations as to what their exposure is. As I said, we've got after the event insurance in place. That is there to protect them in the event that the claim is unsuccessful. We will know, the cases, particularly with the group litigation order, it will be cost budgeted all the way. We will request for it to be cost budgeted, so that we've got a clear view of what the defendant's costs are, so that we know that we've got sufficient insurance in place.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move to Alan now. There's a couple of questions about nanopore flotation today. Many times the basement bargain price that, and I love this, those numpties that Link sold it for. Can we assume that they've got everything wrong from the beginning and will be called to task? So there's a couple of questions on your view on the nanopore IPO.
I think that's not fair on people who are numpties, who are obviously much more intelligent than the average person at Link. So I think numpties should sue on that basis. I mean, what happened was that there was a kind of fire sale collection of kind of good and bad stuff that got parceled up, wasn't there? Including Oxford Nanopure, and it was at a terrible time in terms of the stock market, and a lot of people didn't want some of the stuff, and they wanted bits and pieces. So by definition, the way it was parceled was truly dire. In my view, it's hard to think of a worse way to do it, where you're a forced seller, and not just a forced seller of individual assets. You put them all together so that the good and the bad and the ugly are all parceled into one.
Yep.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. It was so easy for people to pick these companies off. They were listed in the fund documentation, and a lot of people realised that their share prices were going to go down, so they shorted them, and then they bought them back. Quite a lot of private investors did that, and then well, it's just so obvious.
Thank you. It's 6:46, so I'm just going to focus on one. Well, actually, yeah, two further questions. If I may just have one more response from Boz. You're suing for losses resulting from the breaches by the defendant and rules in the FCA's handbook with respect to its management and winding up of WEIF. I detect a slight change in language from the last presentation in winding up. Is there a significance there?
I will say that the way that the way the winding up was managed has aggravated the losses, so it's part and parcel of the claim.
Fantastic, thank you. And finally, if I can just go around, can this happen again? Is one of the questions that we asked on the way through, and I don't think it's been properly addressed. Or there are some hints in the preparations. In the presentations. Just starting with Alan, can this happen again?
Well, unfortunately, yes, because the rules need to change quite substantially, and the degree of regulatory oversight needs to improve substantially, and the whole role of the ACD, which was what Link was, probably needs to change, but they're not really independent when they're essentially really paid for by the fund manager.
Thank you. Cliff, your view?
The FCA have done two things. In 2019, they wrote a letter to fund managers telling them to be a bit more careful on the way in which they manage their funds. And in, I think it was July this year, they wrote to authorised fund managers and ACDs to tell them about how they need to manage their liquidity. So they've done two things. People listen to them. Perhaps, but I think there's both the law, there's culture, and then there's regulation. Each of those have got to be changed. And so two little letters are not going to be enough.
Thank you. And before I turn to Boz on that for a response on that final question, do we have the last poll, please? Fantastic, that's up there. And Boz, do you have a view on whether this can happen again, please?
Unless there's tightening up of the rules, yes, I see it happening again.
Good. Well,
it's happened before.
Yeah.
If lessons haven't been learned, it will happen again.
So, and I think that leads into what Cliff was saying about our campaign aims. Our primary campaign aim is to get investors put back into the position that they should have been in had this harm not been done to them. So the primary focus is to achieve redress where we can. The secondary focus is to ensure that those responsible for this mess actually are held to account, and that's an important part of it, which is more subtle and more difficult to achieve. And the third, which is the most difficult to achieve, is to ensure that there is sufficient regulatory change to ensure that it cannot happen again. And I think, although we are seeing steps in the right direction, I don't think it's fair to say that change has as yet taken place. The results of the final poll, which is who do you hold responsible, 50% of our audience says that Woodford is responsible, be that the person or the company. The 39% blame Link, 8% Hargreaves Lansdown, and 2% the FCA, and 0 others. So there is at least no strange other appearing. With that, I'm going to thank my panel. I apologise to attendees that there are a large number of questions that remain unanswered, but I think we've hit the key ones for you. I hope we've hit the key ones for you. This seminar, a recording of the seminar, will be available going forward. There's a question as to whether the slides themselves would be available, and I think the answer is no, unless you're prepared to run through the video and look at the slides. Cliff, am I wrong?
Mine will be available. I think Alan's will. Jeff's will, because he only had one. I don't know about Boz.
Okay. Well, if people, I mean, I suggest that the right way of replaying this is through the video link. But if people want to request slides, we'll give out those that the presenters agree to give out. With that, I'm going to close with immense thanks to Alan, to Boz, to Cliff, and to Jeff, and to all of those behind the scenes who work very, very hard to make sure that these things happen, and to all of those of you who have taken the time to attend, particularly the 378 that have hung on until the very end at 6:51 p.m. Many thanks. Have a very good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.